From humble beginnings to the highest office in the world, this is the untold journey of Barack Obama. A story of courage, faith, and unbreakable hope. Discover how one man's belief in unity changed history and inspired generations. This is more than politics, it's the legacy of leadership, resilience, and humanity. When we look back on the story of a life, what we see are not just the moments of triumph, but the choices made when no one was watching. The quiet decisions that shape a destiny. The strength that comes from struggle and the hope that refuses to die even when the world grows dark. Barack Obama's journey began not with power, but with questions. Questions about who he was, what kind of world he was entering, and whether he could make a difference within it. He came from ordinary beginnings, raised by a mother who taught him empathy and a sense of duty, and by grandparents who believed that hard work and fairness were not outdated virtues. His story is not the tale of a man born into privilege, but a one who learned to navigate uncertainty with purpose. He learned that identity isn't given, it's built slowly through effort and reflection. Growing up between cultures, continents, and colors, he felt the tension between belonging and isolation. But instead of letting that divide him, he turned it into his strength, a bridge between worlds that rarely spoke to one another. In those early years, he saw two Americas, one of promise and one of pain. And deep inside, he carried a simple but unshakable belief that those two worlds didn't have to remain separate. That empathy could be the thread strong enough to stitch them together. When he arrived in Chicago, he didn't come as a savior. He came as a listener. The South Side wasn't an easy place. It was a community that had been forgotten by power and broken by poverty. But it was there, walking through church basements and sitting at kitchen tables, that he found his calling. It wasn't about politics then, it was about people. It was about mothers working two jobs, fathers looking for dignity, children dreaming despite the odds. And it was there that he learned one of life's hardest truths, that change doesn't come because we wish it to. It comes because we work for it together. That progress isn't handed down from the powerful. It's built up by the hopeful. The young man who had once been searching for himself began to realize that purpose doesn't arrive in clarity, it arrives in service. That the way to find yourself is to lose yourself in the work of lifting others. He saw that unity wasn't a slogan, it was a discipline. A daily choice to listen, to understand, to stand shoulder to shoulder, even with those who don't see the world the same way you do. It's easy to divide, to point fingers, to declare enemies. But real leadership, the kind that heals rather than wounds, begins with listening. Every era has its storms. Every generation faces its test. For Obama, the test was to find light amid the noise, to rise above cynicism without losing realism, to believe in hope without denying hardship. He didn't see hope as naive, he saw it as necessary. Because without hope, there's no reason to keep trying. Without hope, the poor remain invisible, the divided remain enemies, and the powerful remain unaccountable. Hope is what turns a complaint into a cause. It's what transforms anger into action. And so he began to speak, not with arrogance, but with conviction. He spoke about the world not as it is, but as it could be, about the belief that no one's background should define their ceiling. That character matters more than circumstance. That nations, like people, are capable of redemption. He would later say that his entire life could be traced back to one simple idea, that we are bound together by a common destiny. That what happens to our neighbor matters to us. That progress isn't a zero-sum game, and compassion is not weakness. And as the years went on, those words began to take shape not as theory, but as a movement, because movements aren't born in palaces or parliaments, they're born in neighborhoods, in conversations, in the stubborn belief that the future can still be bent toward justice. That belief carried him forward through skepticism, through loss, through doubt. There were days when the dream seemed distant, when the noise of division drowned out the melody of unity. But every time he looked into the faces of people who still believed, he found strength. And it was then, slowly but surely, that he began to understand the true meaning of leadership. It isn't about standing above others, it's about standing with them. It's about reminding people not of who you are, but of who they can be. That is where his story truly began. Not in a position of power, but in a posture of purpose, a man learning to translate his pain into vision, his questions into action, his hope into history. Because the story of Barack Obama is, at its core, the story of what happens when one person decides to believe that words still matter, that empathy still matters, and that the moral arc of the universe, though long, though often unseen, still bends toward justice. And that belief would take him farther than even he could have imagined. History has a strange way of preparing us for what's to come long before we realize it. The lessons that will define us rarely arrive in grand moments. They hide in the quiet grind of the everyday. For Barack Obama, that grind came not in the halls of power, but in the unglamorous work of organizing, listening to people's stories, fighting bureaucracy, and learning that change, if it's real, is slow, hard, and deeply human. Those early years in Chicago were not a campaign, they were a classroom. He wasn't chasing headlines, he was learning humanity. He saw neighborhoods neglected, schools crumbling, jobs disappearing. But more than that, he saw resilience, the stubborn refusal of people to surrender their dignity. And that's what changed him. Because it's one thing to read about injustice. It's another thing to sit across the table from it. He began to understand that leadership wasn't about charisma or control. It was about listening to pain without judgment and translating that pain into purpose. That's where he discovered his voice, not as a performer, but as a bridge between those who felt unseen and the power that ignored them. When he decided to study law, it wasn't because he was chasing prestige. It was because he saw that the law, for all its flaws, could be a weapon for fairness, a tool to rewrite the story of those who'd been written off. At Harvard, he made history as the first black president of the Harvard Law Review. But even then, he never treated that as a trophy. He treated it as a test. Could he stand in rooms that had never made space for people like him and speak not with anger, but with integrity? That question would follow him for years. Because history doesn't just test your skill, it tests your patience, your character, well, your ability to stay humble in the face of power and hopeful in the face of disappointment. When he returned to Chicago, he could have chosen comfort, but he chose service again, teaching constitutional law, working with communities, and beginning to see the bigger picture of what America was becoming. It wasn't just about race or economics. It was about the widening distance between people and their government. A loss of faith in the very idea that leadership could serve instead of exploit. That's when he began to consider something he never planned: politics. Not the shallow kind, not the endless games of ego, but politics as the arena where ideas meet reality. And like every person who's ever tried to change a system from within, he faced the same haunting question. Can you stay true to your principles when power starts to whisper your name? He knew what he was walking into: the mud, the manipulation, the scrutiny. But he also knew that change doesn't happen from the sidelines. And so, with more hope than certainty, he ran. At first, few believed in him. He didn't have a famous last name or a fortune or a machine behind him. What he had was faith, not blind faith in himself, but faith in the idea that people still wanted honesty, that they still hungered for something real. He knocked on doors, stood in gyms and churches and union halls, and spoke not like a politician, but like a man asking others to believe in their own power again. He told them that cynicism was just another form of surrender, that the story of America, like the story of any person, was always unfinished, always capable of renewal. That message didn't spread through headlines, it spread through hearts. Because every generation hungers for a voice that reminds them who they are. But with every rise comes resistance. The higher he climbed, the louder the doubt became. There were those who told him he wasn't ready, that he didn't belong, that the system would never allow someone like him to change it. And to be fair, they weren't entirely wrong. The system resists anything that threatens its comfort. But there's a difference between doubt and defeat. He faced racism, skepticism, and the weight of expectation, but he didn't let it define him. He turned criticism into clarity. Every attack became a test of composure, every obstacle a mirror for his convictions. He once said that the best way to prove yourself is not through anger, but through consistency. And it was that consistency, that calm defiance, that began to draw people to him. By the time he stepped onto the stage at the 2004 Democratic National Convention, few outside Illinois even knew his name. But when he spoke that night, when he told the world that there wasn't a liberal America or a conservative America, but the United States of America, something shifted. The crowd didn't just hear a speech, they felt a spark. It wasn't about politics anymore. It was about belief, the belief that decency and reason could still inspire a nation grown weary of division. That speech didn't make him famous overnight. What it did was awaken something deeper, the realization that people were still hungry for hope, not as a slogan, but as a strategy. And from that moment on, his journey stopped being personal, it became generational, because leadership at its purest isn't about standing in front of people, it's about standing for them. And that's what he did, quietly, deliberately, with the kind of patience that comes from knowing that change built too fast collapses just as quickly. The man who had started with questions was now beginning to embody answers, not perfect ones, but human ones. And as the road ahead grew more demanding, he would learn what every great leader learns eventually, that hope without endurance is just sentiment. The real test of belief is what happens when the world stops clapping. The journey from obscurity to history doesn't happen in a straight line. It's a climb, steep, uncertain, and often lonely. For Barack Obama, that climb began with a simple decision to run not just for office, but for something larger, to awaken a nation's belief in itself again. He didn't walk into the 2008 presidential race with entitlement. He walked into it with audacity, the audacity to believe that hope could still defeat cynicism, that unity could still outlast fear. To most, it seemed impossible. America was tired, divided, weighed down by war, recession, and mistrust. The idea that a young senator with a strange name could stand on that stage and speak of a new beginning was more dream than strategy. But dreams have a strange way of calling to the exhausted. People didn't rally behind him because he promised miracles. They rallied because he promised meaning. He told the nation something it had almost forgotten, that politics wasn't supposed to be a spectator sport, that the future didn't belong to those who shouted the loudest, but to those who showed up. He didn't ask for blind loyalty, he asked for shared responsibility. And that's what made it powerful. Every rally, every town hall, every handshake became more than a campaign. It became a mirror. People didn't just see him, they saw themselves reflected in the possibility of change. He didn't tell them what to believe. He reminded them that they already believed. Still, history doesn't unfold without resistance. The higher he rose, the more fierce the opposition became. They questioned his background, his faith, his name. Every move was dissected, every word distorted. The noise was relentless, but he refused to let it define the narrative, because he knew something fundamental, that anger burns fast, but hope endures. He once said that the road to progress will always be uphill, but that doesn't mean you stop climbing. And climb he did not with fury, but focus, not with bitterness, but with belief. His campaign became a movement of volunteers, students, single mothers, veterans, immigrants, people who had never knocked on a door or made a call for politics before. They weren't following a man, they were following an idea. That the lines dividing red and blue, black and white, rich and poor, didn't have to be the final lines of the story. And in that moment, history began to bend. The night of November 4, 2008 will be remembered not just for who won, but for what it symbolized. The crowd in Grant Park didn't just cheer a candidate, they witnessed a country meeting its reflection. Tears streamed down faces not because a man had become president, but because a chapter once thought impossible had been written. When Obama walked onto that stage, beneath the lights and the weight of history, he wasn't celebrating himself. He was honoring the generations who never got the chance to stand there. The voices silenced by segregation, the hands calloused by labor, the faith that refused to die even when the system said, wait. He reminded America that progress is never the gift of a single man. It is the work of countless, unseen hearts pushing the story forward inch by inch. And yet, as he would soon learn, victory doesn't end the struggle, it only changes its shape. Because power once gained doesn't erase the fight, it magnifies it. As the world watched, expectations rose to impossible heights. Some saw him as a savior, others as a threat. Every decision became a battlefield, every compromise a betrayal. He had promised to unite, but soon discovered that unity is not declared, it is demanded daily through patience, dialogue, and sacrifice. The same hope that had lifted him to history now became the burden he had to carry. Every promise tested by reality, every vision tempered by the machinery of government. He had to learn that progress in theory is clean, but progress in practice is messy, filled with friction, with setbacks, with nights where faith feels fragile. But he never let go of that quiet conviction that had carried him from the South Side to the White House. That leadership is not about perfection, but perseverance. That the true measure of character is not what you achieve when the world applauds, but how you stand when the world questions your every move. He faced an economy on the brink, wars with no end, and a nation fractured along lines of race, class, and ideology, yet through it all, he kept returning to one principle, that decency is not weakness, and empathy is not vide. He knew that leadership, stripped of empathy, becomes tyranny, and hope without discipline becomes fantasy. So he worked not to be loved, but to be useful. Behind the speeches and the cameras, there were quiet moments of doubt, nights when the weight of the office pressed down like a mountain, times when compromise felt like failure and progress seemed invisible. But even then, he remembered why he began to give voice to those who had none, to make politics not just about power, but about purpose. Because history does not remember the loudest voices. It remembers the ones who stayed steady when it mattered most. And through the storms of his presidency, through crisis and criticism, he remained steady, calm, deliberate, unwavering, not because he didn't feel the weight, but because he refused to let it crush what he believed in. That leadership means keeping faith even when others lose it. And in that steadiness, in that endurance, he proved something to the world, that dignity is a form of strength, that grace under fire is not submission, but mastery. And that's what makes his story not just political, but profoundly human. Because no matter how high he rose, Barack Obama never stopped seeing himself as the young man walking those Chicago streets, believing that the measure of a life isn't how much you take, but how much you give back. History rarely gives breathing room to those who shape it. The moment Barack Obama placed his hand on that Bible, the weight of 2 centuries of promise and pain settled on his shoulders. The son of a Kenyan father and a Kansas mother, now standing where so many before him could never stand. It was not just a transfer of power, it was a turning point in the human story. But the applause faded quickly. The same night that made history also marked the beginning of a new trial. Because the truth about leadership is simple and brutal. It's never about what you inherit, it's about what you endure. The world he inherited was wounded, an economy on the edge of collapse, 2 wars raging, a nation divided not only by policy but by perception. The air was thick with doubt. Everyone expected miracles. What they got was a man fallible, determined, and painfully aware that change but honestly takes time. In those first months, when every camera turned toward him, he carried the calm of a man who understood that panic was contagious. He didn't react to chaos, he studied it. He believed that calm was not the absence of urgency, but the discipline to act without losing your setter. He surrounded himself with experts, critics, and voices from every corner of the nation, and he listened, because he knew that wisdom doesn't come from certainty, it comes from humility. The stimulus plan, the auto rescue, the healthcare reform, each decision tested not only his intellect, but his endurance. Every choice meant sacrifice. Every victory carried a cost. But he refused to retreat to cynicism. He refused to govern through fear, and for that he was both praised and condemned. He learned quickly that leadership is not about pleasing everyone. It's about standing by the principles that brought you there, even when they make you unpopular. There were nights deep in the Oval Office when the noise outside grew deafening, the pundits, the critics, the endless stream of blame and expectation. Yet in those hours, when the world's demands collided with human limitation, he turned inward, not to arrogance, but to reflection, because he understood something most forget. The presidency doesn't create character. It reveals it. He knew that history would not be kind to excuses, and so he made peace with the fact that real progress is quiet, often invisible, that the most important changes are not shouted from podiums, but lived in policies that lift people. No one will ever thank you for helping. The Affordable Care Act became the symbol of that quiet persistence, attacked, distorted, fought at every turn, but passed nonetheless. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It meant something. It meant that millions who had been forgotten could finally breathe without fear of losing everything to illness. And while he worked to heal at home, he also faced the complexity of a world that never stops burning. Wars demanded decisions that had no right answers. Lives depended on intelligence reports that were often incomplete, and every choice would ripple through generations. He carried those decisions not as trophies, but as burdens, understanding that leadership in war and peace demands not certainty, but conscience. Through it all, the world saw his calm demeanor, his unshakable tone, his deliberate words. But beneath that calm was a man constantly measuring the line between strength and restraint, between defending his nation and protecting its soul, because power can easily erode empathy. And he refused to let it. He never let the office harden him into cynicism. Even when he faced obstruction, even when the politics turned poisonous, he chose to believe that decency was not weakness, that staying composed under pressure wasn't passivity, it was mastery. He reminded his team that leadership is not about noise, it's about direction. You don't need to shout to move history. Sometimes you only need to stay steady long enough for the world to catch up. But the weight of being the first never left him. Every mistake was magnified, every decision judged through the lens of race and expectation. He bore that quietly, not with resentment, but with grace. Because he knew his story was bigger than himself. He knew that young children of color were watching, seeing in him not just a president, but permission to dream. He knew that people across the world, in villages, in cities, in forgotten corners of struggle, saw in his face a reflection of possibility. And that's what gave him strength when fatigue threatened to overtake faith. There's a photograph taken one evening, him alone in the Oval Office, head bowed, sleeves rolled, the room dimly lit. That image says more about leadership than any speech could. Because that's what true leadership looks like: solitude, responsibility, the quiet ache of carrying more than one life should. But even in those moments, he never gave in to despair. He once said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." And in his presidency, he learned how long that arc truly is and how heavy it can feel to keep bending it. Every president leaves behind both triumphs and disappointments, but few leave behind an idea, the belief that the measure of power is not dominance, but decency, that the test of a nation is not how loud it shouts in fear, but how calmly it acts in courage. And though the storms around him raged, Barack Obama never let the world see him lose his footing, because he wasn't leading just for that moment. He was leading for the memory that would outlast it. He knew that one day the applause would fade, the critics would fade, and all that would remain was whether he had kept faith with his principles. And that he did. Time changes a leader. The same man who began with the fire of hope now stood shaped by the weight of reality. The years had etched something deeper into his face, not fatigue, but understanding. Because there's a truth every great leader eventually learns: change is not an event, it's a lifetime. By his second term, Barack Obama had seen both the beauty and the brutality of power. He had watched how easily good intentions could be twisted, how truth could be drowned by noise, how progress could be met with backlash. And yet, even then, he refused to lose faith. He understood that leadership is not about avoiding pain. It's about walking through it with purpose. When the nation faced tragedy, shootings, protests, acts of terror, he carried the grief not as a performance, but as a personal burden. He stood before the cameras not as a politician trying to manage optics, but as a human being trying to hold a country together. His voice would slow, his tone would drop, and in that silence between sentences, you could hear the weight of empathy. He knew that words couldn't heal everything, but he also knew that silence could wound even more. In Charleston, after the church massacre, he stood at the pulpit and began to sing Amazing Grace. That wasn't strategy, that was soul. It was a reminder that leadership, at its best, is not about command, it's about connection. He reminded the world that compassion is not weakness, it's what separates civilization from chaos. But compassion alone was not enough. He still had to govern, to make decisions that would be dissected, distorted, debated. Every law, every policy came with trade-offs. He learned to live with the knowledge that perfection is impossible, and that sometimes doing what's right means doing what's hard. He took on climate change not as a talking point, but as an existential duty. He brokered the Iran nuclear deal knowing it would divide opinion. He normalized relations with Cuba, defying decades of inertia. And every time he acted, he did it not to be remembered as bold, but to be remembered as responsible. Because legacy is not measured in applause, it's measured in endurance. He had come to realize that hope was not a slogan for the campaign trail, it was a discipline for survival. Hope meant showing up again and again, even when progress seemed impossible. Hope meant understanding that you plant seeds knowing you might never sit under their shade. And while the world around him changed, the rise of anger, nationalism, misinformation, he remained anchored by a quiet moral code to meet hate with patience, chaos with calm, noise with clarity. He knew he couldn't control the storm, but he could control his steadiness within it. In those final years, he also began to look beyond the presidency. He thought about what it meant to lead once the power was gone, how to serve without the title. Because power ends, but purpose doesn't. He began to prepare not for retirement, but for renewal, to turn the lessons of his presidency into something larger, a lifelong mission to empower the next generation. He often said that change doesn't start in Washington. It starts in communities, in hearts, in the belief that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they work together. That's the truth he carried out of office, that leadership doesn't belong to a few, it belongs to anyone willing to step up. But it wasn't all noble reflection. There were moments of regret, moments when he questioned whether he'd done enough. The wars that still burned, the divisions that deepened despite his best efforts, they haunted him. He understood that progress invites backlash. That light, when it shines too bright, reveals the shadows people prefer to ignore. He had promised unity and found a country more divided than when he began. That contradiction cut deep. But he refused to let it break him, because he knew that leadership isn't about achieving a perfect world. It's about keeping faith in an imperfect one. He left office not with bitterness, but with gratitude, grateful for the chance to serve, to learn to fail, and to keep trying. On that final day, when he stood before the people one last time as president, he didn't boast, he didn't gloat, he thanked. He reminded the nation that democracy is not a spectator sport. It demands participation, vigilance, and empathy. And then, as he and Michelle walked up the steps of that helicopter, there was no sense of ending, only transition. He knew that the story of his life and of America was not about one man, but about the constant struggle to live up to one's own ideals. He had come into the White House carrying hope. He left carrying wisdom. And that wisdom was simple, that power is fleeting. But purpose endures. That history is never finished, that we are all, every one of us, authors of the next chapter. When Barack Obama left the White House, he didn't disappear, he evolved. The stage may have changed, but the mission never did. He often said, the presidency is a relay race. You run your lap as best you can and then pass the baton to someone else. And that's exactly what he did. After 8 years of leadership, he walked out of the most powerful office on earth not as a man seeking attention, but as a man seeking impact. The roar of politics gave way to a different kind of purpose, quieter, deeper, and more lasting. He returned to something he had always believed in, the power of people, not politicians, not systems, people. Building the Obama Foundation, a legacy of empowerment, he launched the Obama Foundation, not as a monument to his past, but as an investment in the future. Its mission was simple yet radical: to inspire, train, and connect the next generation of leaders around the world. He wanted to prove that leadership doesn't start with titles. It starts with intention. It starts when ordinary citizens take responsibility for their communities, when young people realize they are not too small to matter and not too powerless to make change. He said, if you think the future is something that happens to you, you're wrong. The future is something you build. That belief became his new campaign, not for votes, but for voices. Rediscover in purpose with Michelle Obama through it all. Michelle stood by him, still his equal, still his anchor. They became global icons not because of fame, but because of integrity. Together, they focused on education, civic engagement, and empowerment, especially for girls and young women. While others chased noise, they built legacy. In interviews and speeches, Obama's tone had changed, more reflective, more grounded. He no longer spoke as Monsieur, but as a father, a mentor, a citizen. He talked about what really mattered: values, empathy, resilience. Or democracy isn't something handed down. It's something we have to fight for, protect, and renew generation after generation. That's the truth he wanted every young person to carry, that freedom is fragile and the work is never done. From power to influence in his post-presidency life, Obama became a global moral voice, not through authority, but through authenticity. He began giving speeches that resonated far beyond politics on leadership change, equality, and the psychology of hope. He traveled the world, Not as a commander-in-chief, but as a teacher of purpose. His words weren't designed to impress, they were designed to awaken. He warned of misinformation, division, and the rise of cynicism. He challenged people to think critically, to engage constructively, and to believe courageously. And yet, even with the world's chaos, he never lost that calm, that steady optimism that once ignited a movement. Because Barack Obama understood something timeless. True power is not what you hold, it's what you inspire. A global icon of leadership and hope, as years passed, his influence grew stronger, not as a politician, but as a philosopher of democracy. His memoir, A Promised Land, revealed the raw truth behind leadership, the doubts, the fights, the loneliness, and the lessons. Readers didn't just see a president, they saw a human being trying to reconcile ambition with idealism. He reminded the world that progress is not a straight line, that hope must be defended again and again against fear and fatigue. His story became more than history, it became a guide, a reminder that one person, guided by purpose, can still move nations. Legacy that lives beyond one lifetime. Today, Barack Obama stands as more than America's 44th president. He stands as a symbol of what leadership can be when it's rooted in decency, empathy, and courage. His speeches continue to inspire students, activists, entrepreneurs, and dreamers worldwide. He doesn't claim perfection, only persistence. He doesn't promise certainty, only faith. He doesn't tell people to follow him, he tells them to believe in themselves. That's the difference between a politician and a leader. And so, as he often says, we are the ones we've been waiting for. The message hasn't changed, only deepened. Hope isn't naive, it's necessary. Change isn't instant, it's earned. And democracy isn't guaranteed, it's built day after day by people who care enough to try. Closing words, the eternal flame of hope. Barack Obama's story isn't just about politics or power, it's about possibility. It's the story of a boy with a strange name and humble beginnings who refused to be defined by the world's limits and instead redefined what was possible. From the streets of Chicago to the steps of the White House, from community organizer to global icon, his journey proves one thing, that the greatest legacy you can leave is not a title, not a monument, not even a law, it's belief. Belief in yourself, in others, in something bigger than any one person. That stubborn thing inside us that insists, despite all the evidence to the contrary, that something better awaits us if we have the courage to keep working, to keep fighting, to keep believing. And that, more than anything, is Barack Obama's true legacy. Not power, not fame, but faith in people, in progress, and in the promise of tomorrow.